Okay, as part of my quest to expose fake history, especially when it comes to Islam, let's take a look at a rather interesting quote from the academic John Esposito. And if you don't know who he is, let me read to you a little bit about him. This information is compiled from various websites, including Wikipedia. Basically, John Esposito is an award-winning professor of Islamic studies at Georgetown University, author of more than 35 books on Islam, editor-in-chief of numerous Oxford reference works, including the Oxford Encyclopedia of the Modern Islamic World and the Oxford History of Islam, advisor to the award-winning PBS documentary Muhammad, Legacy of a Prophet, and perhaps most notably, he's a go-to expert, certainly in his heyday in the early 2000s, following 9/11, when he was frequently called on to brief government agencies, including the State Department, FBI, CIA, Department of Homeland Security, and various branches of the military. So clearly, this man knows his Islam. Here's also a little fun fact. Yours truly was a student at Georgetown University some 25 years ago at the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies. And I do recall seeing him around, and he was essentially treated like a don. You know, his word was law when it came to Islam. So let's take a look at some of his words and see how lawful they are. So let me read to you an excerpt from one of his books, Islam, the Straight Path. This comes from page 64. Pay attention, especially to the first part. 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence elapsed before political events and an imperial papal power play led to centuries-long series of so-called holy wars that pitted Christendom against Islam and left an enduring legacy of misunderstanding and distrust. I can't begin to tell you how utterly preposterous this statement is, but that's the purpose of this video, so bear with me. Here we go. Basically, what Esposito is saying in this excerpt is that from the very beginning, from the dawn of Islam in the year 622 AD, that year corresponds with the year 1 of the Islamic calendar, 622 AD, until the First Crusade, which was called for in the year 1095, and we're talking about 473 years, I believe. It's not exactly 5 centuries, but that's fine. He's rounding it off. He's saying that all that time, the relationship between Christians and Muslims was one of peaceful coexistence until imperial papal power play decided to call for the First Crusade, and the rest is history, misunderstanding and grievances from Muslims. So this claim obscenely ignores the cataclysmic and foundational events that took place during those 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence. In just the first century following Muhammad's death, which is in the year 632, until 732 at the Battle of Tours, Islam, through violent jihadist conquest, annexed 3/4 of what was once the Christian world. If you looked at a map, the Middle East in its entirety, to use the modern names, Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Israel, Iraq, all of that was Christian, as was Turkey, but we'll get into that. And all of North Africa, so from Egypt all the way westward, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, all of that was actually the heart of the Christian world. The 4 major Christian sees, other than Rome, were all there. Antioch, Alexandria, Constantinople, and Jerusalem. And all of that was violently conquered in the name of Islam in that first century. The sources from the period talk about mass massacres of Christians, mass enslavement, the destruction of thousands of churches. Okay, and this goes on all throughout North Africa and the Middle East at the hands of Muslims following the death of Muhammad. And Muhammad himself called for this. 2 years before he died, he ordered the Eastern Roman Emperor Heraclius to submit to Islam. And of course, he didn't. And war was declared, or jihad. Okay, and it's also interesting that, especially in the Islamic sources, in the Islamic historiographical tradition, that these wars are presented as jihads. In other words, the reason Muslims did that they conquered this large swath of Christian territory, 3/4 of it, is because Christians were infidels, and Islam commands the conquest of infidel territory and giving them the 3 choices: convert, or become a dhimmi, pay tribute, etc., or fight to the death. Again, this was just the first of Esposito's 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence. That's what happened. Now, we can get into all the other centuries from that point until the First Crusade, those 5 centuries, but there's no time in this video. I hope eventually to actually make more detailed videos looking perhaps even into every country, how it was conquered and what the original sources say. But suffice to say, it's more or less the same thing. In just the year 1009, the Fatimid Caliph, Hakim B'Amr Allah, according to Muslim sources, I'm stressing this, it's not according to evil Christian sources, he destroyed 30,000 churches in the Middle East, in Egypt and Greater Syria, which of course, again, is a reflection of how Christian that region was. That's what the sources say. That's from al-Makrizi, the Muslim historian. But it's also found in other Islamic sources as well. So at any rate, let's fast forward to just a few decades before the First Crusade, which is still part of Esposito's 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence, because he's saying everything before the First Crusade in 1095 was peaceful coexistence. Okay, so a lot of the quotes I'm going to read to you are from Matthew of Edessa, a contemporary. He was an Armenian historian who actually ended up being killed at the sack of Edessa in 1144, which presaged the Second Crusade. But his source is invaluable, his chronicle, and it's a contemporary, again, eyewitness account for many of the events. Now, he writes that in the year 1019, quote, the first appearance of the bloodthirsty beasts, the savage nation of Turks, entered Armenia and mercilessly slaughtered the Christian faithful with the sword. And then in 1049, the Turks reached the unwalled city of Arsdan and, quote, put the whole town to the sword, causing severe slaughter, as many as 150,000 persons, unquote. Regarding Arsdan, the sack of Arsdan, another eyewitness, Aristakes the Greek, writes, quote, without mercy, they, the Turks, incinerated those who had hidden themselves in houses and churches, end quote. It took 800 oxen and 40 camels to cart out the vast plunder from Arsdan, mostly taken from the churches, about 800, all of which were systematically torched to the ground once they were plundered and the Muslims left. Here's another one. During the Turkish siege of Sebastia in modern-day Sivas, Asia Minor, Anatolia, Turkey, and this happened in 1060, 600 churches were destroyed and, quote, many women and children were led into captivity, unquote. Another raid on Armenian territory around that same time saw, quote, many and innumerable people who were burned to death, end quote. Between 1064 and 1065, Sultan Muhammad bin Dawood Shaghri, better known amongst fawning Westerners as Alp Arslan, the brave lion, the Turkic Seljuk Sultan, he besieged Ani, the capital of Armenia at the time. And once inside, the Turks, quote, began to mercilessly slaughter the inhabitants of the entire city and piling up their bodies one on top of the other. Innumerable and countless boys with bright faces and pretty little girls were carried off together with their mothers, unquote. Not only do Christian sources document the sack of Ani, often in apocalyptic terms, but so do some Muslim ones. According to one source, an Arabic man writes, quote, I wanted to enter the city and see it with my own eyes after it was sacked. I tried to find the street without having to walk over the corpses, but that was impossible. That comes from Alfred Friendly's book, The Dreadful Day, about the Battle of Manzikert. Nor was there much doubt what fueled these Turks' animus towards the Christians of Armenia. According to a man just known only as David, and he's in Matthew of Edessa's Chronicles, he said to his countrymen the following, quote, this nation of infidels, the Turks, comes against us because of our Christian faith, and they are intent on destroying the worshippers of the cross and on exterminating the Christian faithful. Therefore, it is fitting and right for all the faithful to go forth with their swords and to die for the Christian faith, which is what they did, to no avail. They all got slaughtered and enslaved. Now, as the Turks moved westward into Asia Minor or Anatolia, they visited the same sorts of atrocities on the Greeks. Mass slaughter, mass enslavement, and destruction of churches. Here's what the Eastern Roman Emperor of the time, Alexius I, wrote to his friend Robert of Flanders, who himself would participate in the First Crusade. The emperor wrote, quote, the holy places are desecrated and destroyed in countless ways. Noble mothers and their daughters, robbed of everything, are violated one after another, like animals. Some of their rapists shamelessly place virgins in front of their own mothers and force them both to sing wicked and obscene songs until they have finished having their ways with them. Men of every age and description boys, youths, old men, nobles, peasants, and what is still worse to hear, clerics and monks, and woe of unprecedented woes. Even bishops are defiled with the sin of sodomy, meaning they were being raped and gang raped. And this is actually recorded in many sources, not just from the emperor. And so, after the passage of these 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence, we finally come to the origins of the First Crusade. At the Council of Clermont in 1095 in France, Pope Urban II said the following in an assembly amongst the Christians, many of them who were knights. Pope Urban said, quote, "They, Muslim Turks, have completely destroyed some of God's churches, and they have converted others to the uses of their own cult," meaning they made them mosques. "They ruin the altars with filth and defilement. They circumcise Christians and smear the blood from the circumcision over the altars or throw it into the baptismal fonts. They are pleased to kill others by cutting open their bellies, extracting the end of their intestines and tying it to a stake. Then with flogging, they drive their victims around the stake until, when their viscera have spilled out, they fall dead on the ground. They tie others, again, to stakes and shoot arrows at them. They seize others, stretch out their necks, and try to see whether they can cut off their heads with a single blow of a naked sword. And what shall I say of the shocking rape of women? Who is to repair this damage if you do not do it? Rise up and remember the manly deeds of your ancestors." And at that point, this is when all the Christians in assembly, most of them, like I said, knights, stood up and said, "Deus vult," God wills it. And the First Crusade of history was off, ruining those 5 peaceful centuries of coexistence that preceded it. So now you know what was really happening before and led directly to the First Crusade, during John Esposito's otherwise 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians. I should add that the only time that John Esposito tries to address this question of what Muslims were doing to Christians is a few sentences after the excerpt I read. In fact, he basically mocks when the knights got up and said, "Deus vult," God wills it. He writes as follows. "This was ironic that the knights cried out, 'Deus vult,' because, as one scholar has observed, God may indeed have wished it, but there is certainly no evidence that the Christians of Jerusalem did, or that anything extraordinary was occurring to pilgrims there to prompt such a response at that moment in history." The scholar that Esposito is quoting is Francis E. Peters in an essay he wrote called "Early Muslim Empires." Now, clearly, this academic is just as delusional, if not dishonest, as John Esposito. To claim that nothing was happening to Christian pilgrims in the years leading up to the First Crusade is itself extraordinary. Here, for example, is what Michael the Syrian, another contemporary chronicler and eyewitness of the times, writes was happening. As the Turks were ruling the lands of Syria and Palestine, they inflicted injuries on Christians who went to pray in Jerusalem. They beat them, pillaged them, and levied the poll tax, jizya. In other words, they extorted them of money. Moreover, every time they saw a caravan of Christians, particularly those coming from Rome and the lands of Italy, they made every effort to cause their death in diverse ways. Or consider what happened to this large German pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the year 1064. According to one of its survivors, quote, "Accompanying this journey was a noble abbess, a head nun, of graceful body and of a religious outlook. Setting aside the cares of the sisters committed to her, and against the advice of the wise, she undertook this great and dangerous pilgrimage. The pagans, the Muslims, captured her, and in the sight of all, these shameless men gang-raped her until she breathed her last, to the dishonor of all Christians. Christ's enemies performed such abuses and others like them on the Christians." End quote. So there it is, the truth about John Esposito's 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence between Muslims and Christians, until those evil European Christians ruined it all by launching the First Crusade. Let me read to you that excerpt again so you can remember it. Pay attention. 5 centuries of peaceful coexistence elapsed before political events and an imperial papal power play led to centuries-long series of so-called holy wars that pitted Christendom against Islam and left an enduring legacy of misunderstanding and distrust, which is why, of course, Muslims have grievances and engage in terrorism today, etc., etc. That's the sort of thing he tells all those governmental agencies. All right, now ask yourself this. If Esposito and so many other academics and experts just like him who are regularly consulted, including by governmental intelligence and military agencies, can lie so flagrantly about 5 entire centuries in an effort to blame Christians for starting hostilities with Muslims. What else are they lying about when it comes to the relationship between Islam and the West?